The rain had poured for hours when Mason Carter took that quiet mountain road home. He had to be home before 9 for his daughter's birthday. But when his headlights swept over a smoking luxury sedan in the ravine, he didn't hesitate. He scrambled down into the dark, cutting the woman free. He pulled her clear merely seconds before the fuel tank erupted. Then he quietly drove off unseen. His daughter was waiting, and tomorrow brought more work. He had no idea the woman he rescued was Evelyn Grant, the wealthy CEO secretly preparing to buy the company that fired him. Let's look at Mason's story together. Because sometimes hidden character gets rewarded when you least expect it. What unfolds next will absolutely prove you right. Mason was 34. He had carried the heavy burden of 2 lives entirely alone since his wife, Dana, passed away from a sudden brain aneurysm 3 years ago. One routine morning, she just kissed him goodbye. Walked little Ella to the school bus stop, and by noon she was simply gone. No warning signs, no lengthy illness to prepare for, and absolutely no slow, gradual goodbye. Only a hospital phone call, followed by a heavy silence that settled permanently into their empty apartment. Mason took just 2 days off from his job and then went right back. Rent doesn't pause for grief, and his daughter's asthma medications certainly weren't free. He worked as a mechanic and part-time delivery driver at Blake Logistics, a mid-sized freight company hauling industrial parts and supplies straight across that dangerous mountain corridor. The pay was completely unremarkable. The hours dragged, and those trucks were much older than any official safety certificate claimed. But the job was steady. Mason was an honest man, gifted with engines, so he stuck around. Every extra dollar earned on those evening delivery routes went directly toward Ella's asthma medication. Her basic school supplies, and a tiny savings account he funded in amounts nobody else would notice. But he kept quietly adding to it regardless. Right there on the dashboard of his battered old pickup, he taped a precious photograph of Ella from her very first day of kindergarten. Grinning wide with missing front teeth, wearing a heavy backpack almost as big as she was. You and I know how life tests true character. That night, the mountain road tested him brutally. The mountain route twisted blindly through sharp switchbacks right above a dark, narrow ravine. And the endless rain had turned the asphalt into something resembling a raging river. Mason drove cautiously, his headlights carving faint, pale columns through the heavy downpour. The worn windshield wipers completely losing their furious battle against the rain. He was 20 minutes away from home when that awful sound hit. It was not subtle. It was the violent crash of heavy steel hitting a highway guardrail at speed. The terrifying shriek of tires losing traction, suddenly dropping entirely away from the level highway. A grinding heavy concussion as something massive tumbled down the steep embankment into complete darkness. Mason slammed the brakes. He jumped from his truck before the terrible echo faded across the canyon walls. He leaned over the twisted guardrail and spotted the disaster immediately. A black luxury sedan lay overturned, its bright headlights burning uselessly straight into the thick mud. Thick smoke poured from the crushed engine compartment. The vehicle sat precarious on a narrow ledge, roughly 40 feet below the highway, jammed against sharp rocks. Staring through the shattered windshield, Mason clearly saw someone trapped inside that twisted wreckage. Acting unseen, he grabbed the small emergency medical kit from behind his seat. Inside were simple tools, a box cutter, a flashlight, and worn work gloves. Plus a frayed tow rope he had kept around so long it felt like part of the truck. Without an audience, he charged down the embankment. The muddy slope was treacherous. He slid most of the way down on his boots, grabbing onto wild brush and jagged rocks to stop his fall. Reaching the wrecked car, the sharp stench of gasoline hit him. That lethal odor meant his window to help was closing. Inside sat an unconscious woman in her 40s, but her chest was moving. The violent rollover had locked her seatbelt tight, trapping her at an awkward angle. Pulling her out meant having to slice through the heavy strap. Mason wasted no time. He slashed the tight belt with his cutter, yanked the door handle, and realized the brutal crash had completely jammed it. He rammed his shoulder into it, applying a very specific controlled violence. The kind earned by 15 years of solving mechanical problems with pure physical force. The metal groaned open. He leaned inside and wrapped his arms around the stranger. He dragged her away from the wreckage, using the kind of raw strength that leaves deep aches in a man's muscles for days. He hauled her 15 feet up the muddy hill, right as the ruptured fuel tank finally hit its deadly ignition point. The blast was not movie magic. It was sudden, ugly, and brutal. A scorching shockwave blasted up the hillside, searing the back of Mason's heavy jacket as burning shrapnel hissed into the cold rain falling all around them. A sharp piece of flaming debris sliced across his left hand. He never broke his stride. Reaching the pavement, he gently laid her down, checked her steady pulse, and immediately dialed 911 on his rain-soaked cell phone. He gave them the location. Reported her unconscious with a possible concussion. He confirmed no severe bleeding and told them she was breathing steadily. The emergency dispatcher ordered him to stay on the call. He held his ground until the distant wail of sirens started echoing up the dark mountain pass from the valley. Then he quietly wrapped his bleeding hand in an old greasy rag, climbed back into his beat-up truck, and drove away into the night. He left no name behind. You and I know real character doesn't wait for applause. It was 10 minutes past 9. His daughter Ella was waiting, while the cheap birthday cake-riding shotgun had taken a beating during his heroic scramble and now leaned sadly to one side. He steered with his injured, wrapped hand resting painfully on his knee. His good hand gripped the wheel. His only thought was getting home to his little girl. Mason lived up on the 3rd floor of a crumbling building that had clearly seen better decades. The ancient elevator had been totally broken for 8 months, and the deadbeat landlord had long stopped replying to maintenance requests. So he silently climbed the stairs, carefully holding the damaged cake. He found sweet Ella right where his heavy heart feared she might be, fast asleep at the kitchen table. Her little head rested on folded arms right beside a tiny cake she had secretly bought using the meager allowance she had saved up. A single lonely candle had burned down to a tiny sad stub of wax. She wore that bright yellow sweater she only ever saved for special occasions. She waited for her dad as long as she could. Mason set his battered cake beside hers, sank into the chair opposite her, and just watched his sleeping daughter for a long, silent moment. You and I both know the unique agony of disappointing someone who loves you unconditionally. It was a bitter feeling Mason knew well. Gently, he reached across and touched her small shoulder. Ella stirred, slowly lifting her head. She blinked at him. It was that slow, trusting confusion of a kid waking up. Seeing her father's exhausted face, she smiled. Then she spotted his hand wrapped in a greasy rag. Instantly, her eyes sharpened, a heartbreaking alertness kids only develop when they spend way too much time worrying about a parent. She quietly asked him what happened. He explained he had pulled over in the dark to help a stranger survive a brutal highway crash. Ella just looked at him steadily. She didn't cry or complain. She didn't even ask if this meant her birthday cake was ruined. Instead, she climbed down, walked straight around the table, and wrapped her small arms around his neck. She whispered that their mom would be so proud of him. Mason held his little girl tight. He stayed silent, knowing no words could ever improve on a truth like that. Together they lit both candles, her tiny stub plus a single wax stick he dug out of a drawer, and they sang happy birthday in those gentle, hushed voices people use to keep from waking the neighbors. Then they ate cheap cake at almost 10 on a school night. True character shows in quiet moments. For Mason, this messy, imperfect birthday was the most beautiful one he could remember. He tucked Ella into bed at 10:30, double-checking she used her evening asthma inhaler. He was washing his burned hand at the sink when his cell phone suddenly buzzed. A text from his boss, Jackson Blake Direct, no greeting. Written by a man who never filtered his arrogance. Be at the office at 7 a.m. sharp. We need to talk. Mason read it twice. His stomach sank with that cold dread only a struggling single father feels when jobs threaten. He crawled into bed, fully aware sleep wasn't happening tonight. Let's look closely here. Blake Logistics sat in a cheap flat building near the freight yards. The exact kind of place that screamed one clear fact about its owner: ruthless efficiency mattered, while human comfort absolutely did not. Mason pulled in at 6:55. His injured hand wore a fresh bandage, his heavy jacket hiding those hidden heroes' burns. He spotted his direct manager, a nervous guy named Dennis, pacing anxiously in the hallway right outside the main glass office door. Dennis wore a fake neutral expression that completely failed. Dennis quietly muttered that Blake was waiting inside the big conference room. Mason asked why. Dennis just looked away, muttering he thought Mason already knew. Jackson Blake was 51. He grew this whole shipping outfit from a measly 2-truck fleet into a 20-vehicle business using a toxic mix of real industry smarts and a ruthless management style that treated good employees as mere expenses to chop. The boss wasn't a stupid guy. He was something much more revealing. A guy who learned early on that the easiest path to money always pointed morally downward. He treated safety protocols like cheap bargaining chips. And anyone mentioning dangerous conditions wasn't a warning to heed, but an enemy he had to crush. Over 2 years, he had publicly fired 3 mechanics just for reporting broken fleet trucks. So when Mason handed in a formal written grievance 8 months ago listing bad brakes and quoting safety laws, "You and I know doing right brings unexpected karma." Because Mason's true character meant he quietly learned the exact rules. Jackson kept a formal complaint in a drawer. He viewed Mason as a minor annoyance to eliminate whenever the timing felt right. Today you and I see that exact moment arrive. Jackson stood tall at the main conference table, keeping Dennis right by his side. 3 other shift managers sat as silent witnesses. He laid out the case against Mason Carter with the cold, practiced rhythm of a frequent executioner. The official charge was incredibly simple. Mason had supposedly abandoned his delivery route last night, leaving freight untouched, plus he clocked in an hour late for his mandatory morning shift today. Jackson conveniently ignored that this schedule change was texted to Mason at 11 last night. He completely dismissed Mason's desperate explanation about the crash. The trapped woman, the terrifying explosion up on that dark highway. He listened with the blank face of a boss who had already decided it was a lie. When Mason finally stopped talking, Jackson smoothly pointed out the lack of proof. No police file, no witnesses, and that in his experience. Employees who skipped shifts usually invented wild excuses for it. Mason stayed remarkably calm, insisting the local paramedics had a file. He begged them to check the highway traffic camera footage. Jackson claimed that wasn't his problem, adding that Mason's clear history of insubordination. That heavy word hung in the quiet room, making the unjust firing feel completely legitimate. Mason scanned the table. He saw absolutely 0 allies today. Dennis just stared at his notes. The other managers stared blankly at the wall, too afraid to defend a good man. Jackson coldly declared that Mason was officially fired, effective immediately. His last paycheck would be frozen to cover the fake damages from that undelivered cargo, and building security would march him straight out the door. Before Mason could even react, Jackson twisted the knife deeper. He spoke in the disgustingly casual tone of a boss who shows off his power through pure cruelty, saying, "What a tragedy it was that a solo dad failed at basic job duties. That someone in Mason's poor financial spot shouldn't make such reckless choices. And he surely hoped little Ella understood why their rent check was going to bounce." Mason absorbed that vicious threat, and something inside him went totally silent. The kind of profound silence right before a man's spirit breaks or turns to steel. He stayed completely mute. He never even raised his voice. He refused to give his cruel boss the pleasure of seeing him crack. He calmly stood up, grabbing the tiny paper bag of locker belongings Dennis had silently fetched for him. He gave the room one brief nod, then walked out. The security guard, a nice kid named Kevin who often ate lunch with Mason, escorted him out, keeping his guilty eyes glued to the floor. Mason gently told him not to worry. They exited through the main lobby, the heavy glass doors locking shut behind them. Let's pause and look at him here. A burned hand, a cheap bag, 0 paycheck. His mind raced to the expensive medicine little Ella needed by the end of the month. But 40 miles away, resting inside a private suite at Ridgeline Medical Center. Character shows when no one is watching. A woman opened her eyes, assessing what she knew. She was Evelyn Grant, and she knew she was lying in a hospital bed. She could tell from the specific sharp pain. The ache across her ribs and heavy pressure behind her eyes meant a brutal highway crash. And she knew with that same sharp business clarity that she was lucky to be alive. She could have easily died out there unseen. A doctor walked into the room, diagnosing her with a mild concussion. 3 fractured ribs, plus deep bruising across her shoulder and hip. She listened quietly, asked 2 quick questions about recovery, then asked who pulled her from the wreck. The doctor shared what he knew. It wasn't much at all. A man called emergency services, waiting in the shadows until the paramedics arrived. Then he vanished, no name, not waiting for praise, a selfless act unseen. Paramedics noted the wrecked vehicle was completely engulfed in flames when they got there. Whoever dragged her out did it in a terrifyingly narrow window of time. And her jammed seatbelt was sliced open with a sharp blade. That was all anyone knew. The mountain pass had traffic cameras, and the state might have plate records, but no one had checked yet. Evelyn's executive assistant, Charlotte Reed, her most trusted colleague, showed up within the very first hour. Charlotte was fiercely loyal and efficient. She was thorough, proving her worth through quiet, hard results instead of loud, empty appearances. Evelyn gave her the crash details and gave one clear order: find the stranger who saved her life. Charlotte tracked him down in 2 hours. A pickup truck license plate matched a man named Mason Carter, 34 years old, living down in the valley right below that treacherous mountain road. He worked as a mechanic and delivery driver, a struggling single father, and according to his most recent employment records, which Charlotte quietly pulled from a contact with database access, he got fired that very morning from Blake Logistics officially for job abandonment and gross insubordination. Charlotte silently slid the summary onto Evelyn's tablet. Evelyn read it completely stone-faced. That was her way of silently absorbing heavy facts before taking action. Then she read it again. Let's look closely here. She noticed Mason Carter had filed a formal safety complaint 8 months prior with Blake Logistics, calling out specific safety violations. A complaint that was completely ignored in the shadows. Plus, 3 other drivers got fired recently just for trying to report similar workplace hazards. She remembered the corporate accident file she was studying right before the crash. The massive dossier on Blake that was sitting in her back seat when the car rolled. Her team spent 6 weeks building that corporate buyout file for a massive company acquisition. That hidden file held its very own dark set of concerns regarding the logistics company's failing maintenance and driver welfare. She thought about the stranger slipping down a muddy hill in the dark just to cut her jammed seatbelt while her fuel tank was heavily leaking. He lost his job for it, but sometimes kindness returns when least expected. Karma moves fast. Evelyn Grant certainly didn't build her empire slowly. She grabbed her phone and immediately contacted her legal team. You and I know buying Blake Logistics wasn't a complex legal puzzle. The company held heavy debt, its cash flow wobbled, and Jackson Blake, who never expected a buyer to show up with such sudden speed and massive capital, made foolish mistakes during the negotiations that an actual capable, more seasoned business leader would easily avoid. He blindly signed terms giving Evelyn total control within 48 hours. He only knew the buyer was some regional logistics firm looking to expand its footprint along the corridor. But the true identity of the real buyer stayed entirely hidden. He signed the papers with the arrogant confidence of someone certain every tough situation breaks his way. Then he went home that night feeling incredibly proud. A mandatory company meeting was set for 9 the next morning. Jackson arrived wearing a sharp blazer, expecting to meet the new owners and negotiate about his high-ranking role in the expanded company. Instead, he found a packed boardroom and a complete stranger standing at the far end of the long mahogany table. She radiated that dangerous kind of calmness people only show when they already know exactly how the upcoming battle will end. She introduced herself clearly as Evelyn Grant, head of Grant Holdings and as of yesterday the sole owner of Blake Logistics. She spoke without drama, stating an undeniable fact she expected the entire room to simply accept. Jackson sank into his chair. The room fell dead silent. Evelyn announced she had one urgent issue to settle before discussing any corporate future. She demanded to review Mason Carter's official termination file. Jackson's face twitched through panic before settling into a controlled mask. He claimed Mason Carter was a highly problematic worker, and firing him was just standard procedure after multiple performance failures. Evelyn stared him down with a chilling focus, calmly repeating her request to see the paper trail. Someone handed over a folder. She read it quietly as the room held its breath. Then she opened her laptop. Let's look at the evidence together. She spun the screen, playing 90 seconds of footage pulled directly from a mountain highway traffic camera. The grainy video showed a beat-up truck pulling onto the dark shoulder at 10:47 p.m. It captured a shadow leaping bravely over the guardrail. Minutes later, it revealed that same man dragging a helpless victim up the steep bank. It recorded the fiery blast, then showed the truck driving away at 11:03. Evelyn pulled up an emergency call log from 11:01. A man sounding exactly like Mason reported the critically injured woman's precise location and condition. Next came the tracking data from Mason's own company delivery scanner. It proved his final delivery was finished at 10:31. The route perfectly matched a hero pausing his shift on a dark mountain pass to save a stranger's life. Desperate, Jackson accused Mason of plotting this whole presentation with Evelyn beforehand. He insisted the timeline looked highly suspicious, claiming anyone would question the bizarre timing of a billionaire swooping in right after a driver gets fired. He bluffed hard, but you and I know his fate was sealed. And quite a few in the room squirmed. You and I know that look, folks quietly realizing their boss is sinking. Over by the wall, Charlotte Reed calmly opened another folder. Inside were printed emails revealing what Jackson did when nobody was looking, ordering the maintenance boss to skip vital brake checks on 4 trucks way past their legal deadlines. The file held 3 bills for secretly faked repair work that had never actually been touched, and a hidden 14-month-old incident report, bravely handed in by a driver named Roy Tanner, detailing a terrifying brake failure on Route 11 that ended in serious property damage. A file quietly marked, resolved in the shadows, with 0 investigation or heads-up to state authorities, which was strictly required by law. Jackson Blake stared at that folder, doing the rapid kind of dark math a guilty man does when his hidden sins finally trap him in a corner. He viciously snapped that Evelyn had absolutely no right to barge into his business and tear down the leadership empire he built over 20 years using fake claims pushed by an angry worker and some wealthy woman's personal vendetta. He shouted this loud enough so that it was obviously meant for the whole room, not just for Evelyn. Evelyn replied, keeping that true, unshakable dignity she held all along, that she possessed every legal right. She bought the business and could expose its buried secrets. And she was officially handing him a suspension, pending a massive deep-dive compliance audit, a report that would go straight to the proper government oversight boards. Then she calmly asked guards to march Mr. Blake outside. Jackson shot up, violently knocking his chair backward. He glared across the room at the empty chair where Mason Carter was supposed to sit, snarling that Mason would deeply regret making an enemy out of him. 2 of the company guards finally escorted him right out. The room stayed dead quiet. You and I know true power is silent. Evelyn just gave Charlotte a knowing nod. At 11:15 that morning, Mason Carter got a call from an unfamiliar Blake Logistics number. He was just sitting quietly at the kitchen table, staring blindly at a cold cup of coffee. With Ella at school, the apartment felt heavy and silent. Doing the brutal math on surviving without a paycheck before this month turned into a total disaster. He answered with that deep exhaustion of a good man expecting nothing but bad news from strangers. A gentle voice introduced herself as Charlotte Reed, letting him know he was needed back at the Blake Logistics office as soon as humanly possible to discuss his current job. Mason asked if this was just another shady corporate trick to steal his hard-earned withheld wages. Charlotte softly said it was not, and her voice held that rare hidden sincerity that made him trust her word entirely. He promised he would be there in 1 hour. He dressed with care. It was a proud habit he kept up through 3 years of unseen struggle. A quiet personal discipline having absolutely nothing to do with ego, but everything to do with true character. How a man stands tall when nobody else is watching him. Kindness was waiting. He drove down and parked. Let's watch Mason. He just stepped back into a building he never expected to enter again. The lobby felt wildly different from when he was fired 24 hours ago, though he couldn't define why. Then, the truth hit him. Every single person was staring. Their faces lacked that usual, awkward distance of coworkers trying to ignore a fired colleague just to spare their own feelings. A few actually looked relieved. Someone gently guided him toward the main conference room. A quiet woman in her early 40s stood right in the center of it. She was perfectly composed, radiating a sharp, watchful intelligence. Mason had seen that look before in people who survive something truly terrible and carry the hidden weight forever. He absolutely recognized her face, but he had seen her in a much different light. The harsh orange glow of a burning, overturned car resting on a dark mountain ledge. He remembered her face being pale and totally unconscious, her hair soaked heavy with rain. It took his brain 2 full seconds to match that tragic memory with the powerful woman standing before him. He froze in his tracks. Evelyn Grant looked at him and spoke his name like a hard, absolute fact. Then she simply said, "Thank you, not," with the frantic, overwhelmed, tearful drama people use when they want their gratitude to perform for an audience, but rather with the deep, direct, heavy sincerity of a woman who weighed her quiet words carefully and meant every single syllable. She confessed she was alive solely because of his selfless action. And she knew that hidden heroism had cost him his job. And she intended to make that unexpected sacrifice right today. But first there was a quiet truth she needed him to hear. She had found and read his forgotten safety complaint from 8 months ago. She tracked down every buried document showing exactly how management had swept it away. She knew his quiet courage, filing that safety report and firmly standing behind it. Refusing to stay silent about dangerous trucks when nobody else cared proved exactly what kind of man he truly was. It was the exact same thing. The man fighting for safety behind closed doors and the hero descending that dark cliff were identical. Such true character is rare. Mason stood quietly in that conference room with 20-odd people staring at him and insisted he hadn't done a single thing any decent person wouldn't naturally do. He spoke with zero false modesty. He meant it literally. Evelyn gently noted that was exactly the problem. Most decent people do nothing when doing the right thing demands a brutal personal cost. You and I know the difference between claiming value by them when nobody is watching. Mason stared quietly at the floor for a second before finally meeting her gaze. He simply told her he was glad she survived. Mason wouldn't discover the full truth until days later, after Evelyn's corporate audit team dug deeply into the company's hidden logistics records. They exposed the greedy, rotten reality of what Jackson Blake secretly built over 2 decades. This wasn't some minor case of occasionally cutting corners just because money got tight. It was a totally cold, systematic practice. The ignored maintenance was deeply chronic. Massive delivery vehicles were running miles past their legal safety dates completely routinely, with a fully corrupt supervisor, openly ordered to forge unseen inspections and blindly file fake safety paperwork, claiming strict federal compliance, using records that were entirely fictional. You and I will see what happens in the shadows. Drivers were scheduled for shifts violating federal rest rules. Managers quietly altered the route logs afterward to fake perfect compliance. Whenever honest workers pushed back, raising valid safety concerns verbally or in writing, or simply by doing the right thing and refusing to drive a commercial vehicle they knew was fundamentally unsafe. True character showed in management's calculated, punishing response. A harsh formal warning for that first honest complaint. A second warning for persisting, then wrongful termination for resisting. Unseen by the public, withheld final paychecks acted as a cruel punishment and silent deterrent. Take Roy Tanner. You and I know him as the brave driver reporting failed brakes on Route 11. He stepped out of the shadows, voluntarily telling the audit team everything. Bosses had falsely assured him the danger was handled. Instead, he was quietly exiled to a terrible route. He ultimately quit once he realized that exposing hidden safety problems only brought targeted workplace retaliation and unseen suffering. Kindness sparks courage. 2 more former drivers came forward after Jackson's sudden suspension. One survived a bad crash 17 months earlier, an accident he had always suspected was caused by a dangerous deficiency he had flagged 3 weeks prior. Looking closely at the hidden records, auditors confirmed his darkest suspicion. The corrupt firm had secretly buried it as driver error. Many others existed. Soon, regulatory referrals were heavily filed by Evelyn's legal team with state transport authorities and the Federal Motor Carrier Safety Administration. Those illegally withheld wages, not just Mason's, but 6 other drivers secretly robbed of their final paychecks under similarly cruel pretexts. Evelyn's unexpected kindness ensured everyone was repaid in full with interest within 10 days. As for Jackson, karma arrived. He hired a lawyer and stayed completely silent. Whatever this cruel boss thought his life would be at 51. It certainly did not look like this. The sheer arrogance that let him secretly cut corners for decades vanished in just one single week. It curdled into a cold, quiet reality he would spend years reckoning with alone. When Evelyn unexpectedly offered Mason a top position as Operations Safety Supervisor, he sat quietly for so long she finally asked if she had offended him. No, he replied, his true character shown as he wondered if he could genuinely succeed. She explained she didn't need a fancy corporate guy with a logistics management degree. She needed an honest man who truly understood the unseen costs drivers faced daily. The grinding physical cost, the financial strain, the burden of raising kids on tight wages while still finding the inner strength to remain honest about major problems the greedy company desperately ignored. She needed someone whose unseen integrity would finally guide every single decision about how this company operated. Humble as always, Mason worried the other drivers might just see blatant favoritism, assuming he was just another guy rewarded for a secret connection to ownership. Evelyn smiled. She knew his true character would reveal itself entirely through his hard work. You and I know the truth. No one witnessing his quiet dedication would ever call it favoritism. Mason simply said he had one firm condition before he accepted. Every driver with stolen wages needed full restitution before he would sign a single document. Evelyn quietly confirmed it was already handled. Mason nodded, finally accepting the new position. You and I know how real change happens. It whispers through a workplace, spreading among workers who were silently watching from the shadows, afraid to admit they still held out hope. 2 seasoned drivers on the brink of quitting quietly chose to stick around. A veteran dispatcher named Linda. She had spent 11 years there, quietly watching 3 honest mechanics get pushed out just for speaking the truth. She silently dropped a plant on his desk his first morning, never uttering a single word. He kept that little plant. Charlotte was the one who urged Evelyn to visit his apartment, not for some cold corporate reason. She felt the little girl deserved a direct thank you. Evelyn knew deep down she was absolutely right. That Saturday, Evelyn showed up carrying a cake from the finest bakery in the entire valley. Crisp white frosting, pink letters, and Ella's name spelled perfectly. She hiked past the broken elevator up to that 3rd-floor door, paused, and finally knocked. Little Ella opened the door. 8 years old, looking rather small for her age. She shared her father's guarded eyes, wearing a yellow sweater someone had recently and gently washed. She studied Evelyn with the careful gaze of a kid who learned early how to judge character. Glancing from the sweet cake back to Evelyn's face, she innocently asked if it was her birthday too. Evelyn softly told her no. She admitted missing the real birthday and sincerely apologized, offering the treat to make things right. Ella weighed this quietly. She then asked if Evelyn was the woman her dad pulled from that wrecked car. Evelyn nodded yes. Ella replied she was glad she survived, admitted she had worried about her injured hand, and politely invited her inside. Mason stepped into the kitchen doorway, wiping his hands on a dish towel, looking exactly like a man caught completely off guard by this unannounced visit. Evelyn promised she would not stay long. He kindly offered her a seat and started brewing some coffee. They gathered around the exact same kitchen table, where Ella had waited alone that night, where an unseen father silently crunched numbers for medicine while a solitary birthday candle burned down to absolutely nothing. And they just talked. Ella sat between them, enjoying her slice with the intense focus of a kid who treats dessert like serious business. Mid-bite, she casually asked Evelyn if her job was actually important. Evelyn softly said yes. Ella cheerfully replied that was lucky since her dad nearly sacrificed his entire job just to save hers. Don't give people a hard time, Mason gently scolded her. I'm not, Ella shrugged, I'm just saying. Staring across that cramped table, Evelyn saw a quiet dignity she desperately wanted to burn into her permanent memory. It wasn't about the mechanics of the rescue. You and I know it wasn't about the corporate drama or business consequences. It was simpler. She had built an empire through choices made from a comfortable position of power and access. Wealth, education, and the compounding perks of early business success. For years, she told herself her massive success was a pure reflection of her values. But Mason acted on those true values in the dark with zero of those advantages. Picture a dark mountain road, rain falling, 10:47, no one is watching. He had a daughter waiting home, and a job barely hanging by a thread. The woman lived because of his courage. She spent a long time reflecting on that unexpected kindness. That spring, the logistics company was quietly and officially renamed. The new sign simply read Grant Carter Transportation. There was no flashy press release or loud public announcement. The new title simply showed up on the building, fleet trucks, and company letterheads. The crew working there understood the quiet shift in values. Nobody needed it explained. They ran a massive safety audit, ensuring every single vehicle finally met strict compliance. The maintenance schedules were entirely rebuilt from scratch, making every single detail totally verifiable. Independent contractors documented every inspection, keeping those crucial records open to any driver asking. Driver pay was fairly restructured, finally rewarding their actual hours and brutal road conditions. And that shady habit of altering route logs was wiped out completely by a GPS system Mason helped design, listening closely to the driver's own input. Because he had walked in their shoes himself. And he understood exactly what the system had to fix. They built an emergency fund for employees hitting sudden hardships like medical bills or childcare gaps. The exact unseen burdens that completely derail a hard-working family overnight. Mason naturally stepped up to serve on the review committee, doing the quiet work on Wednesday nights, long after Ella was asleep. He definitely was not a flawless boss. He tackled the unfamiliar parts of his new role with that same quiet, methodical patience he used to fix broken-down engines, breaking things apart and simply asking questions when he lacked the answers. By showing genuine honesty about the things he didn't grasp yet. When he messed up, he owned it openly. That kind of integrity is rare in management, quickly earning everyone's trust. You and I know trust is earned. Skeptical drivers came around, not because he was some dramatic, flashy hero, but because when real issues crossed his desk, he refused to just hide them away. Every single morning, he personally drove his daughter to school. Not out of necessity, mind you. The bus stopped just down the street from their apartment. It was a choice, a daily decision just to be present for the peaceful moments of her life, not just the emergencies. They chatted in the car about whatever happened to cross Ella's mind. Anything from school science projects to deep questions about the integrity of the adults she interacted with daily. Mason always gave her the raw truth, which seemed to give her real peace of mind. He kept that photo on the dash, the one showing Ella on her very first day of kindergarten, beaming brightly at the lens. That adorable gap between her front teeth had vanished by now, but she still smiled with that exact same joyful spark. One crisp morning in late autumn, driving back from the school drop-off, Mason cruised the mountain road back. No real reason, except the early canyon light looked breathtaking and he finally had a little time. He rolled past that exact stretch of guardrail, perfectly repaired since the night of the crash. You could see exactly where the fresh steel met the older, weathered metal. Slightly different shades of silver, and he instinctively hit the brakes, slowing down. At dinner, Ella asked what he'd been thinking about on that mountain road, because you and I know unseen kindness always returns. Because she caught that look on his face when he slowed. He asked how she even knew. She told him he always pulled this specific expression when wrestling with deep thoughts. Over time, she had simply learned to spot it. He admitted he was just thinking about choices. How the truly life-altering decisions rarely ever look like massive choices in the actual moment. They just look like the very next step right in front of you. Ella chewed on that, both literally and figuratively. She asked if he knew, scrambling down that steep embankment, that rescuing a stranger would actually lead to all of this. Mason shook his head. He hadn't considered the outcome for a single second. A woman was trapped inside a wrecked car with a busted fuel tank. It was leaking gas. Those were the only facts that mattered. You and I might wonder exactly what Ella asked next. If he knew in advance it would cost his job, what would he have done? Mason sat quietly for a second. He would do the exact same thing. He explained that sometimes, the only truly honest answer to a question like that is already knowing what you are going to do long before you even finish asking it. Ella nodded, as if this perfectly confirmed some theory she was already building. Later that night, she casually asked if Evelyn would come to her next birthday party. Mason admitted he wasn't sure. Ella just said it might be really nice, then quietly wandered off to finish her homework. Mason stayed seated at the kitchen table in the quiet apartment, reflecting on the 6 unbelievable months that passed since that rainy night on a dark mountain road. Thinking about the strange grinding randomness of how one event triggers another. About how choosing to be entirely honest over a broken truck brake line and risking yourself for a woman in a burning wreck were the exact same action, just in totally different contexts. His mind drifted to Evelyn, who had stepped in and out of his world with such pure directness and respect, never once demanding a single thing from him. He realized they were now talking every couple of weeks about the business, and those calls were suddenly stretching much longer than work or ever required. He didn't even try to figure out what that meant yet. He simply trusted that certain things followed their own natural timeline. Outside that kitchen window, the mountains stood dark against a sky, barely clinging to the very last fading light of day. Down below, the city was waking up in a slow, steady spread of amber and white. Somewhere down in that valley, a heavy freight truck was running. The North Highway corridor, driven by someone who logged his rest hours honestly and was steering a commercial vehicle that actually passed its safety inspection that very morning. And another driver was heading home to eat with his family. You and I know none of this was true a year ago, but it was true now. Mason realized what it actually meant to change things, not through one massive, heroic, dramatic act, but through a steady, quiet pile of small, consistent, costly choices to do the right thing, especially when looking the other way would have been so much easier. He remembered that old photograph sitting on the dashboard, and that birthday candle burned down to a tiny stub. Then the sweet sound of his daughter saying she thought Mom would have been incredibly proud. He smiled, thinking the exact same thing was probably true. The rugged mountains were dark, and the sprawling city was bright. Tomorrow, Ella had a massive school project on ecosystems that she definitely hadn't even started yet. Mason had an early fleet audit meeting. True character pays off, and tonight there was leftover cake in the fridge. And all of it, the unseen weight of an ordinary life. It felt worth protecting when nobody watched.